This episode is brought to you by Red Riding Hood, the manga-inspired take on the classic fairy tale for readers grades K through 2, written by Christina Oxtra. In Red Riding Hood, readers review the classic story in a brand new way, with twists in the story, more diverse characters, and featuring Japanese aesthetics incorporated throughout. Red Riding Hood is part of a series published by Capstone and written by various artists with unique takes on your childhood favorites. Look out for Red Riding Hood, available on Amazon and your local bookstores. Congratulations, Christina, on your first published book. The link is in the show description.
Hello everyone, and welcome to 1v1 with Boss Rush Games. I'm your host, Celeste of Nintendo Power Block and another Zelda podcast. Today I have the pleasure of interviewing David Lasby, a contributing writer at Zelda Dungeon and Zelda Informer, an English teacher, aspiring novelist, literary analyst, and activist. Hey, good evening, David. How are you doing?
Good, thank you for having me. That feels like a long list. I feel like I'm not worthy. Thank you.
Oh, that's a good list to have. Very eclectic as well.
That's right.
I like that. All right. Well, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I am so excited to have this chance to get together and talk about things that I'm passionate about, and hopefully as a community we're passionate about. So I'm really happy to be here.
Well, thank you. I think it's important to hear from different walks of life and different points of view, because I don't know if you're familiar with Daryl Davis. He's a black man who has converted former KKK members.
Oh, right. Yes.
Yes. So his approach, which I find so breathtakingly simple, yet also very scary, he said his approach was to talk to people he disagrees with from a place of respect, that not necessarily they would change his mind, but it would help them feel heard. And that is the first step in the right direction to helping someone who disagrees with you or maybe even dislikes you, to seeing where you're coming from. I think it's really important to help people feel heard. And that's what Boss Rush Games does, not just on serious topics. I know that sounded like a very bleak topic, but so many people have so many passions and just different approaches, different talents, and we're here to shine a light on that. So I'm really excited because I accidentally messaged David a few weeks ago.
That's right.
Because Ed had told me that we were interviewing David from Zelda Dungeon. And I thought, oh, David Lasby. So I messaged him saying, I'm so excited for our interview. And he said, oh, I can't wait to tune in, because he was thinking of the other David Nystrom, who's writing The Era Without a Hero. And I felt like I had egg on my face and was so embarrassed. But then that actually birthed a great conversation with the David we have here. And I thought, well, he is a writer for Zelda Dungeon. Let me get to know him and see if he's interested in doing one of these. So it worked out.
It did. It's funny. Some of the best things in my life have happened that way. So, I'm all for it. And just before we get too far, I really appreciated what you said about the goal of Boss Rush Games, and that really resonates with me personally. Both, to my teaching philosophy, which we'll get into later, but also, nobody ever accused the video game community of not being passionate. So, I think that shoe fits. So that's great.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you. And I think video games help to bring people together. I know they get some bad press, maybe certain circles, but there are so many good people. We can't discredit that.
Absolutely. I agree with that. We should definitely not judge anyone by the comment section of anything, because I think sometimes we like to hold up the worst cross section of our humanity and then try to paint, with broad brushstrokes. Can't do that. So.
Yeah, and we'll get into that, because there's an article that you wrote for Zelda Dungeon that got a lot of heat, but I enjoyed it. I thought it was really cool that you played this series and you saw these things, and oh boy, we're going to have some really good discussions today.
Right.
I love it. you can't go by the comments section. It's sometimes I wonder, are these people who are hurting? I don't mean that sarcastically. Are
Sure.
these people who don't feel like they are heard in their real lives, so they take to a virtual stadium, a virtual forum, and is that where they feel heard, and they let their pain out, their anger out in that way, and they direct it to someone who's not even necessarily hurting them?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think that's absolutely fair. I mean, my approach that I at least aspire to, I don't always do it successfully, but is compassion first and empathy first. And, whether it's in a classroom or an article that I've written, my first thought is, I wonder what's going on. One of my best colleagues that I work with in teaching has reminded me often that I need to approach with a curiosity mentality rather than leading with anger or leading with frustration. But tell me more about what's going on there. Why are you feeling that way? What's going on today? So.
That's really important. And we're all human, right? We're all gonna, like you said, it's not all the time. I mean, if you're having a bad day and that match gets lit, we're all human, right? It's just we have to decide what dominates. Gosh, we're getting really deep, and we haven't even started the interview. I'm sorry, David. But let's talk about your career as an English teacher, since you brought up your colleagues. So what inspired you to enter this field, this profession?
Gosh, so much. It's hard to narrow it down, but I would say for me, my trauma background growing up, which is something I wrote about recently as well, really was challenging as a child, coming from a broken home, a home with domestic violence and a whole host of other issues. School and, to a lesser extent, sports were places that I felt like I had some control in my life, and that I could maybe make some decisions about who I am and the direction my life heads. And so I did find success in the classroom early on, and that was a real bright spot for me. And so I really latched on to teachers when I was at school and just wanted to learn from them, understand how they got to where they were, and to use learning as an opportunity to have the kind of life that I wanted to have instead of my family defining that. And so, that education really saved me in a lot of ways from following the footsteps of trauma, as so often happens for folks who survive trauma. And I knew that I wanted to give that back to other people, to offer that same empowerment that education gave to me. And so pretty early on, by 9th grade, I knew I wanted to be an English teacher, and focused on that quite a bit. So much so that, I did that kind of classic adolescent thing of, if it wasn't related to what I wanted to teach, I just, went to sleep in my honors math classes, which I soon was not in honors math anymore. And then I got to college. I went to the University of Washington, and, being a freshman, I was low on the registration priority list. So I had to just take some random class. And the random class that filled my schedule was a Forestry 101 class. And I just fell in love with it, and realized, like, wow, I think I want to study science as well. And so I almost actually went into being a science teacher instead. And of course, I had to then hire my friend to tutor me in all the math that I slept in through high school, and was kicking myself, realizing, man, you just really never know what turn your life is going to take. So I had to work doubly hard to get back that knowledge. But by the time I graduated, I had a Bachelor of Science in Forestry and Environmental Science, and a Bachelor of Arts in English. And then I went back and got my master's in teaching. And, that gift that knowledge has been to my life is something that I strive every day to share with my kids. And I tell them, look, I know a lot of you are in my class, don't ever want to open another book again after you're done in my class, but help me identify what you're passionate about, and let's show you how reading and writing can get you there. And that's kind of been something I've tried to live by, and something that fills me up and makes me want to get out of bed every day. So yeah, that's why I went into teaching.
Oh, I can tell you're just glowing talking about that too. So your students are very fortunate to have a teacher who cares so much.
Thank you.
Yes, because I have an English degree as well, and my concentration was creative writing, but in addition to that, lots of literature. And of course, there were people growing up. I'm sure you saw some of your fellow students, maybe not so much on the college level, but the lower level, secondary, elementary, middle school, who weren't quite as passionate about reading. And sometimes I wonder if it's because the subject matter just didn't grab their attention.
Sure. I think that's totally fair. In fact, probably one of the most fulfilling things that I've done in my teaching career, a colleague and I decided to, for lack of a better word, challenge the school district about their curriculum and completely rewrite and blow up the 11th grade curriculum to be more inclusive. And so we got rid of a lot of the, sort of very stuffy classics that, kids today don't like read, that are largely, written by straight white men, which, that's fine, but that's not very reflective of the kids that we have in our classroom. So we try to be more inclusive of diversity, of sexual orientation, gender, race. And what we found when we recreated the curriculum was that kids actually want to read when the author looks like them, when the author has the life experience they did. And so that did really develop a love of reading that we hadn't seen before. And that was a huge breakthrough, I think, for us. I think we started out from like an equity perspective of just trying to be more inclusive. And we ended up at a place where we found, that actually can create a love for reading. Like, it does, just because we have screens and video games, which obviously are important to me, doesn't mean kids can't enjoy reading and storytelling. So.
Oh, yeah. And so I have to ask, and there's no right or wrong answer to this.
Sure.
So do you prefer to read with a physical book or on your Kindle or an e-reader, or both? Does it matter?
It absolutely matters. I'm 100% in the hard book camp. I can't do e-readers. I read a lot of news. I consume a lot of news on my phone. But if I'm sitting down to appreciate a work of art, I want it in my hands. And for that matter, I'm going to buy a game cartridge too. I don't like downloading the games either.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about having it in my hands. Maybe that, makes me a traditionalist. I don't know, but.
Yeah, that's how I feel too. Like, I'll read news on my phone. Like, okay, I want some quick information. I don't want to, something I'm not necessarily devoting a ton of time and energy, but I like holding a physical book as well. There's just something like the physical experience of turning a page and the smell, and I don't know, like, okay, this is in my hands. I have to focus on what is in my hands right now.
Yes.
Yeah. And like I said, guys, there's no wrong or right answer. If you guys like your e-readers, please, at least you're reading and enjoying someone's very hard work. Very hard work.
Very hard work.
So in our pre-show discussions, David was telling me that he teaches both at the high school level and at the college level. Is that correct?
More or less, yes. So
more or less.
I am technically employed by a local college in the area, but I still work in the high school. So I teach regular high school classes, and then I teach through this program called College in the High School, where kids will get full college credit for the class that I teach, and then I have to, run my curriculum by the college so that it's an official college class on their transcript. So it's a little bit of a hybrid.
Kind of like an AP class?
Yes, like AP, except that it's not an AP credit. It's their college transcript will look like they took college classes at that college or university. So it's really nice for the kids. I wish we had opportunities like that when I was in school.
Yes, they keep getting so many cool classes and so many cool opportunities, but I think that's a good sign because we're progressing in that direction. And so what you were saying with your colleagues about changing the curriculum for the junior year material. Now, what I studied my junior year in high school was American literature. Is that the case where you are?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So you probably read like Huckleberry Finn and maybe like The Crucible or other sort of famous American literature.
And To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yep.
We did read, after we read To Kill a Mockingbird, we read A Lesson Before Dying by Ernest Gaines. He's a local Louisiana author, not my exact town, but she did want us to compare and contrast the two because they did have similar themes.
Sure.
Those. So I think it's great, especially when your students are going out into the big bad world, that they have that exposure. Do you think that helps them when they get to college, if they've been exposed to different books that you guys are trying to push on that level?
Sure. And I think there's definitely a need for balance. Certainly books that are considered canon or historically great books are there in that way for a reason. And it's not that we were trying to knock those. And we want kids to be prepared for college where they're going to have a cultural knowledge of these great books. But at the same time, what is the goal for learning? Is the goal for learning to have status and class and to be able to say that you have more knowledge than other people, or is the goal of learning to be transformative? And we firmly believe that the goal of learning is to be transformative. And if that's the case, then that exposure to all different walks of life and all different types of people is really, really important. And it's why I love English. It's what I believe English is important for, is to create an understanding of the world around us and to create empathy and connection and hopefully build a society that includes everybody. So I think that's important to have curriculum that exposes kids to, like you said, they're going to go out in the big bad world, and their first experience meeting somebody different shouldn't be, oh my goodness, you exist, I didn't know you existed. It should be, oh yeah, I remember this before, I've thought a little bit about this, and I have some more curiosity about who you are and what makes you tick, so that's the goal.
And I like that as you were discussing it, it just clicked with me. Okay, so that's American literature. America is a melting pot. So there should be other voices. Sure, have us read about the Age of Enlightenment. Have us read Edgar Allan Poe. I do love my spooky Edgar Allan Poe pieces. Absolutely. But especially as you look at slavery, they were Americans. They became Americans. They became part of this culture, this history. Their voices need to be heard. Sojourner Truth. And there's another author, I cannot remember her name. She was a slave girl, but I don't know if she was kept as a slave, but I guess her master had her educated, if you might know who I'm referring to. I cannot think of her name.
And I apologize. It's probably something I should know. I'll probably remember later in the middle of the night.
Yes, I'm picturing her beautiful portrait, and she was a lucky example because I guess I don't know if they kept her as a slave or they took her in as more of a daughter. I do apologize for if I get any terms incorrect, but she was very fortunate because they believed in her education, and she ended up writing lots of poetry, lots of essays. And I think that is inspiring, and that's amazing. We need to hear her voice. We need, as we get to the 20th century, the 21st century, we need to hear more voices beyond.
Yeah, I think, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No.
I think, certainly widening who gets to tell history. We kind of have this term in education, decolonizing history, because history has certainly been told from a singular perspective for a very long time. So getting those historical voices from women or women of color is really important. And I think the other kind of piece of that is also contemporary voices. I think sometimes we have the sense that being old makes things good art or important. And if something's new, it almost can't qualify as literature yet. I think as a culture, we could change our perspective on it a little bit, because I think what I've found and what my colleagues have found is that when we include voices that are relevant to kids, when we include voices about what's happening in our country now, they buy in, they want to read, it relates to their life, it's more accessible to them. And so I think that's been a real challenge as well, is to try and find literature that both brings out a different perspective in the past, but also helps them shine a light on what's going on now, because there's a lot going on in our country now, so. Yeah.
So tell me, when you were taking classes in the college level, were you did you become more excited as you got to the more modern pieces, or do you have a special place in your heart for the older pieces? Do you have a preference, I guess?
Yeah, that's tough. So I would say when I was in college, I really was just hungry to learn about what was done before and sort of what is the knowledge and wisdom that's out there. So I was trying to read through as many of the classics as I could. And, some of them are pretty dense reading. I did fall in love with Russian literature quite a bit. Dostoevsky is one of my favorite authors. Just because he has such an awareness of social class. And I think for me, that was something that was always on my mind, coming from a lower middle class background, but with all the trauma and everything I experienced in my life, there was a good period of my life where I felt like an outsider. And so to be able to read someone that was so aware of these class distinctions and how we separate one another as human beings and how we ought to approach with love and compassion, that just really lit a fire in me. So I love Dostoevsky, but probably the thing that brought me the most joy in college was this really unique course that I got to take at the University of Washington. It's called African American Science Fiction Literature, and it was an entire class on this like super narrow sort of niche subject, and it was awesome. It was the first time that I read someone who's my personal hero now, an author by the name of Octavia Butler, who wrote Parable of the Sower, and she's actually a Seattle writer. She is just incredible. She's profound, and she imagines sort of these dystopian futures in the United States where we haven't gotten our act together as a country. And I every so often, every few years, I go back and reread that, and I'm surprised at how prophetic she is in many ways. And so science fiction and fantasy literature, while not often recognized as literature by maybe stuffy academics, is where my heart and passion really are. And that bleeds into my love of video games too, for sure.
Do you ever feel this way? And thank you for sharing that. I've heard that name. I'm going to have to look into her literature. Thank you for that. I joke with people when I meet them, when I tell them I major in English, I'm like, I'm not criticizing your speech. I am not going to make fun of you for what you like or don't like, or it's okay if you didn't care for Moby Dick. I was taking three English courses that semester and I didn't even finish Moby Dick. Just we're people too. We're not judging you harshly, please. Well, those are some really good points. Thank you for that. And so you mentioned Russian literature. Are there some other, and you mentioned Octavia Butler's works. What are some other favorite novels or literary pieces that you enjoy?
Well, I am a big Lord of the Rings fan. So that Tolkien is an author that has greatly inspired me. I also grew up reading a lot of C.S. Lewis's fantasy books like Chronicles of Narnia. Anything that's really imaginative. George MacDonald, who I believe was Scottish, is considered the father of fantasy writing. He wrote a book called Fantasies way back in the early 1800s. And both Tolkien and C.S. Lewis credit him as being their inspiration for fantasy literature. And so I went back and found his sort of coming of age story of a boy who wanders into fairyland and for his 21st birthday and has to sort of find out who he is as a person by exploring this mythological landscape. And that really struck a chord with me growing up and influenced the way I think about, storytelling and video games and art forms in general. So those are some authors that really stick out to me when I think about that.
Awesome. Thank you. I mean, there's so many, and there's so little time, so many books to read, so many games to play, so much art to appreciate. And I really appreciate you talking about mentioning, I should say, the classics, and the older something is, the more prestigious it is. I always, since you live in Seattle, I'm going to bring it up. I love Frasier.
Oh, yes, me too.
And I love how he is foiled so many times, and excuse my language, he makes an ass of himself quite a bit. Absolutely. And I love, but he's someone who's very highbrow, and he holds his nose up to things that his dad likes. His dad's more of a blue collar guy, but things that bring his dad joy are just as valid as the opera house that brings Frasier joy.
Absolutely. I love the tension between that. As both a lifelong Seahawks fan and somebody who loves literature, watching in between those two is really wonderful.
Yes, and we're big Saints fans down here.
Yes.
So. But I would love to go to Seattle. It looks absolutely gorgeous. All right. So now this is going to be an interesting segue. We're going to talk about something I consider art, video games. What do you think about video games as art, that argument?
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts about that. It's something that I feel really passionate about. As an English teacher, I'm in an environment where we do talk about literature as art regularly, as would be expected, and the classics. And I would even say just within those conversations about literature, anything that gets out of very realistic, very serious, very stuffy examinations of the world, anything that goes beyond those borders isn't really taken seriously. And so things like the ability of science fiction to reveal something unique about our humanity by examining something that isn't humanity, right? I feel like science fiction, when it's done well, is some of the most profound literature that human beings have created because it's disarming. It gets us to examine our biases, our bigotry, the ways in which we treat each other by tricking us into doing it. Because here we're reading about an alien civilization, or we're reading about robots or whatever, but we're not reading about robots. We're not reading about aliens. We're reading about ourselves, and we don't often even realize it. And I find, whether it's teaching or reading, that the best way to create change is to build empathy and compassion before the person even realizes that's what's happening in their life. So I feel that same argument about science fiction literature is true and more with video games. I feel very strongly that video games are the next evolution of storytelling. And my hope, and maybe this is getting out there a bit, but I hope that, 300 years from now, we have museums full of video games that people go back and look at. Oh, do you remember Breath of the Wild from the early 21st century? Yeah, that was one of the first, Nintendo games to really totally embrace, or rather the first Zelda game to embrace open worlds. What does that tell us about culture in the early 21st century and the skepticism of institutional rules and institutional thinking and the need to have linear storytelling? And so I think video games have that ability to be art, to tell us about our culture, to tell us about our humanity. And I hope that we have museums full of video games in the future.
That would be so cool. Oh my gosh, I love the deep dive.
Yeah. One other thing I would just add to that too, I actually, in the article I wrote for Zelda Dungeon, which I know we'll get to later about social class, I had a quote in there from Nathan Deardorff, while I look at my notes there. And he had said something to the effect that there's no other art medium where people so intensely identify with it. When people read Moby Dick, they don't say, I harpooned the whale. When they watch, Rocky, they don't say, I defeated the Russian boxer. But when they play video games, they say, I opened the chest. I defeated the boss. And that is something so unique to this art form. And we talk, I believe it was Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, talked about walking a mile in other people's shoes, right? Well, with video games, we don't have to just imagine walking a mile in someone else's shoes. We literally walk that mile in someone else's shoes. So what a powerful art form to create empathy if done right.
Oh, God. Yes, I remember that quote in your article, and it stuck out with me so much because it made me think. I recently posted a status of Paper Mario, the Origami King on Twitter, and it made me think. I didn't say Mario just finished the last streamer. I said I completed the last streamer. Right. Which I guess is true because he wouldn't be doing much of anything if I wouldn't turn the console on.
That's true.
I love that quote. It's brilliant.
And I know this has been said many times, but with my favorite video game franchise, The Legend of Zelda, the whole origin of Link as a character being the sort of focal point or link for the player, the link between the virtual and physical world, right? I think gets back to that very idea that video games from the beginning, at least with their highest aspiration, were meant to be a place where we experience on a personal level something beyond our daily norm.
Yeah. I love horses, but I don't own one, but I can go horseback riding virtually in the comfort of my living room.
Right.
So I love that. So that what makes me want to ask you, what are some of your earliest memories of games and some of the first games you remember playing? What was your introduction to this world?
Well, I have been a Nintendo fanboy for since the beginning. Certainly I was born in the mid 80s. So, I guess that was kind of the end of Atari's run and really the start of, the Nintendo Entertainment System. So I think my first video games that I remember playing were the original Super Mario Brothers and, not being able to jump over the gaps because I just wasn't quite old enough yet to know how to do that. But really early on, I got into Legend of Zelda and particularly that the original classic, the ability to just go anywhere, explore anything, and to tell my own story because there wasn't really a whole lot in the way of story was something that really captivated me and allowed me, even though I was playing a video game, was also leveraging my imagination and sort of telling the story in my own head, and that really grabbed my attention. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to ask if you were someone who came up with your own stories while playing video games.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
I think it's, and I was an only child, am an only child. So, there weren't a lot of siblings around. There weren't any siblings around to sort of entertain me. So I definitely had to find ways of entertaining myself. I mean, even playing the early sports games, there weren't ways to have a season, right? You could play individual exhibition games. So I would, get a big spreadsheet and be writing notes about my wins and losses and trying to track and create a season on paper because, what else are you going to do when you're a 7-year-old kid by yourself without siblings?
But it helps you get creative in a way too, huh? It helps
Absolutely.
you have that ability to express yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've probably stated this, so I apologize if this is a repeat, but what is it about The Legend of Zelda that grasps your attention? I guess it would be that could be an overall aspect. You could talk about a favorite game, whatever you want to say about Zelda.
Sure. Well, I wrote about this a little bit in an editorial that took me quite a bit of time to write because I had to break through some personal mental barriers. But I wrote about my trauma history and what a special role Zelda, and particularly A Link to the Past, played for me. As a kid, I think I struggled a lot with this idea of how to be brave in a world with very adult problems, domestic violence and divorce and neglect and certainly other things going on in the home. And, when I was sitting in front of that TV screen for a few hours with this little green hero who, wasn't afraid to face the world of challenges around him, that inspired me. And I wanted to be like that. And particularly in A Link to the Past, there's this moment where, it's the first dungeon that Link has to face, and he has to go win the Pendant of Courage. And that really stuck out to me of like, wow, okay, here's this kid who he wasn't even supposed to be on this adventure. It was his uncle's adventure and he died. But then all of a sudden he's way over his head and he's winning this thing that proves he belongs. It proves that he has the courage to be in this very adult world, and he does it. And I was hooked after that. And that's always stayed with me. And I've really had an appreciation for those games. And even as an adult, playing Breath of the Wild during, another stretch of my life that was pretty challenging, to have that space to explore, to escape, to just be. I feel like that Zelda series came back in my life again in another way where I needed it for my own mental health. So Zelda certainly has a special place in my heart. I play a lot of other games as well, but that one sticks out.
Oh, it's such a fun series as well. Do you have a favorite Zelda game?
It would definitely be one of the two I mentioned. I probably have to give the nod to Breath of the Wild just because I enjoy playing it and I've put so many hours into it, but Link to the Past is definitely right there. So
what is your favorite part in A Link to the Past, you would say?
It's probably a little cheesy, but when I still tear up a little bit when he pulls the Master Sword out of the pedestal for the first time. I found that so captivating and inspiring as a kid. But just being able to explore and have this sort of world that you can truly escape into and, experiment with, what happens if I just throw this boomerang into this random fountain? Oh, look, now I have the magical boomerang. And just that, endless possibilities gave me the space to have a little bit of power in, a time in my life where I wasn't necessarily empowered. So that stays with me.
I think my favorite, I don't know, the favorite part, I guess the part that comes to my mind is when that man is talking about his son. He's at the tavern. He's talking about his son who plays the flute, and
Yes.
he can't find him.
He misses him. He wants him to come back.
I know, it breaks my heart. But spoilers for anyone who hasn't beaten A Link to the Past. There are a lot of happy endings during the credits. So, and Breath of the Wild, my goodness, just did your jaw kind of drop a few times while you were playing that game for the first time?
Absolutely. I mean, I know the moment's kind of cliche now, but that first moment you come out of the Shrine of Resurrection and stand up on the hill and you see the whole world before you. I felt like I was 5 years old. Like, just like brought me right back to that moment of playing for the first time and thinking like, wow. So Nintendo, I know there's lots of issues with Breath of the Wild and everybody has their favorite criticisms, but boy, did Nintendo knock it out of the park with just that wow factor of being able to explore possibilities and the sense that anything is possible.
Yes. The first time I saw one of the dragons in the background, I just shrieked in the living room. I was like,
yeah.
Is that a dragon? Is there a dragon in this game?
That's true. That would definitely have to be another one of those moments for me.
Yeah, it was outstanding. I loved it. Well, what about the animation? Do you have any particularly favorite art styles that you would like to see the series return to?
Well, it's a little controversial at Zelda Dungeon. There's quite a few Twilight Princess haters out there, and I know that it's kind of an ugly game in a lot of ways, but I love a dark Zelda game. I love the graphical style and the sort of weirdness of a game like that. Like, nobody really looks normal. People's faces are kind of too big or seeming out of place, and it's just so, I don't know if eclectic is the right word, but it really just resonated with me how sort of odd and unique it was. So I really enjoyed Twilight Princess. Maybe I'm a little blinded by nostalgia there. It's hard to argue with Wind Waker. At the time, I'm probably like many people, I hated the cartoony graphics of Wind Waker, and now as an adult, it's impressive. So those two stick out to me.
Yes. I was really upset when Wind Waker was not going to look like that demo they had at E3.
Yes.
But I remember a friend told me, oh, the creators wanted it to look like you were exploring through the eyes of a child, which makes a lot of sense.
That's beautiful.
Yes. And the music in that game.
Absolutely.
It's just outstanding. It's so good. And it's funny that you bring up Twilight Princess with the strange faces, because some of the characters, even in Ordon Village, I'm thinking of the shopkeeper. I cannot think of her name, but she's very in love with her cat.
Yes, the cat lady.
Yes, she has a very round face, very squinty eyes. Right. They're almost bizarre looking, but it fits. It fits with that game really well. So how did you become a contributing writer for Zelda Dungeon? Apparently, you're obviously very passionate about the series. So how did this come about?
It probably would never have happened if there wasn't a pandemic. I mean, I was just sitting around doing dishes, is pretty much my regular routine being home with the kids during the summer. I just find like I'm endlessly in the kitchen and just longing for mental stimulation. And so I was going through my podcast, and I had been regularly listening to the Champions Cast, which is the kind of the podcast that they do for Zelda Dungeon. And they were having a promotion for a fundraiser for Black Lives Matter. And I just remember thinking, man, this is really cool. Like, these are some people that love Zelda as much as I do. And they also seem to really care about what's in the world. I wish I had friends like this, and that had all of those interests in common with me. And I kind of just had this slap myself moment, like, well, why don't you reach out to them? And I was like, no, I can't do that. Like, that doesn't make sense. I was like, all right, whatever. I worked up my courage, sent an email out into space that I figured I would never hear back from, and asking to be a part of Zelda Dungeon. And like 2 weeks later, I got a email from Andy Spaturia, inviting me to do an interview and send a writing sample. And I still kind of feel shocked to this day that I stumbled my way into this writing position. And it's been so awesome. It's been a great creative outlet for me. It's a great opportunity to grow in writing. And I feel very comfortable with essay writing, obviously, as a teacher. And I feel pretty comfortable with creative writing. I've been working on a novel for the last 10 years and feel pretty comfortable with that. But news story coverage and sort of that kind of writing was a new area of writing for me. So it was great to grow a little bit and having to cover, so-and-so put out this song that's based on Zelda and having to write like a news coverage. So it was just a great chance to grow, and I'm really thankful to be there.
That is cool. You get to stretch your journalism muscles.
Yes.
I'm very fond of Zelda Dungeon. I'm sure most listeners are either following Zelda Dungeon or at least have heard of it. It is a wealth of information for Zelda and some beautiful articles. I love it. I'm always excited whenever I see one pop up, and on my Twitter feed it's shared. So do you have to follow any kind of strict like AP guidelines, or is it pretty free form?
I think, there are certain formatting things that they like just to keep the aesthetic of their website. And so that's been a little bit of a growing thing for me to learn how things are done. In fact, when I first wrote my article on classism and The Legend of Zelda, I had sent it to Andy, who's the editor for these types of editorials. And I had like all my APA citations and, works consulted and all this. And he's like, David, you got to delete all this. This looks terrible. Like no one's going to read this, And it was really valuable feedback for me. Like, oh yeah, I got to write for audience. This is not, something that's going in like an academic journal. Lose the citations, Lasby. And so, I did. And I begged and pleaded to at least hyperlink my sources so that others could read those. And Andy said that was fine. So, so I would say that those are kind of the guidelines that I've had to learn to grow into, but it's pretty free over there overall.
That's awesome. So it's not as restrictive as like newspaper writing, where you're writing for, I believe my friends who majored in that said you have to assume that your audience has no more than like an elementary, middle school reading level. If they just want to know who, what, when, where, why, how.
Yes, exactly. And I suppose it also kind of depends on what kind of story or article I'm writing. I've had to learn to be concise with my language when I'm describing some Lego creation that, people aren't going to want to read my whole paragraph. They're just going to look at the picture. So yeah, that's a good reminder as well.
It's, I really enjoy how you guys can kind of pretty much cover whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it seems like. So you brought up the article, which I really enjoyed.
Thank you.
And in our pre-show conversations, our pre-interview conversations, David was telling me that this particular article garnered a little bit of heat. And I read it and I thought, oh, this is just his examination of what he is seeing in these video games. How do people get so angry? And then I made the mistake of reading the comments section.
Yes.
That article. And David, why don't you guide us through this journey if you are open to talking about it?
Yeah, I think, again, this was a good lesson in audience for me. I think I have this love of literature and literary analysis, and I have this love of video games, and often the two worlds don't overlap. The folks in my video game world, which is totally fine, just aren't really particularly interested in literary analysis. And my, English colleagues don't always really have the time of day for video game talk. So I kind of, when I got to Zelda Dungeon, I thought, all right, I made it. This is my chance. Like, I'm going to dive in with literary analysis and, video games. And it was a good learning curve. I think coming in using such academic language just on a surface level, I think makes people feel like you're being too stuffy, or they think back to someone in the academic world who has been condescending to them. And, certainly that was not my perspective at all. So I think I bumped into that a little bit. And I think also, we're in a particular time period in the United States where things are really heated politically. And so any buzzwords at all that make people feel you're wading into politics just elicits fear, and I think fear in the sense of, I love my Zelda games, keep your blank out of my Zelda games, whatever the blank is for them. And so, and I get that. I'm not, trying to put anybody down for that. I love my Zelda games very much, and I'd be upset if somebody just used it for a soapbox. But from my academic training coming into video games, my instinct and thought has always been, hey, here's this discipline and this tool to better understand the world. Wouldn't it be really cool? Wouldn't it be really interesting to look at games and just see what we see when we shine a flashlight on it? And so that was definitely my approach for the article. Thinking about social class. We live in a time period where we have pretty big wealth disparity in this country and a big gap between people who have and who don't have. And I just was wondering what the Zelda universe and the Zelda video games have to offer in terms of being art that could help us shine a light on that.
Yes, because like you were saying with science fiction and fantasy, you're not really reading about an ogre versus an elf necessarily. Right. You could see those tones of racism or class disparity echoed in the real world. And as creative as people are, sometimes I feel like you're morphing what you see, what you observe, what you feel into this piece. Mm-hmm. It's reflected. So it might not be verbatim. You might not come out and say, oh, well, obviously this group hates this group.
Yeah.
But like that. So, I enjoyed that article.
Thank you. Well, and my hope was just, let's not reinvent the Zelda series, but just, we always have Link as the chosen hero, right? He is the one chosen by the gods to set the world right. And while I love escapism as much as the next person and fully own that a big part of my upbringing was finding escape in The Legend of Zelda, that doesn't necessarily fit with the world we have now, that we don't have a chosen hero from the gods who's going to come and set things right in our country. We don't have the chosen one who's going to fix racial disparities or gender disparities or income disparities. So wouldn't it be interesting if we had a hero in Zelda who is just a regular person who had to come along and find a solution in spite of not being given all the tools or gifts to work with? And wouldn't that really speak to some of the pain that we already feel right now? I think all of us probably hope on some level that even though we're hurting, we have what it takes, that we can maybe do more than what we even think is possible for ourselves. And wouldn't it be great to have a hero like that, even just for a single game in The Legend of Zelda? So.
Yeah, because even though, like you mentioned in the article, he's usually a commoner, he's in some cases a farm boy, just different, I don't want to say lowly, but not prestigious or royal bloodlines kind of his status. Yes. But he is always destined. He's always elevated. Mm-hmm. And your discussion of that made me think about the part in Ocarina of Time where Zelda is sad that she took away 7 years of his life. So she wants to send him back in time so he can relive those years and gain that back, because time is something you usually can't replace. So that also, I always wondered whenever I play that and I get to that scene, I wonder if she's also sad because they can't really be together. Mm-hmm. I don't know. There are different interpretations, but sure. I always wondered. A lot of people do like Zelda and Link together in the romantic sense, but I always took it as she was sending him back to his life and she's going back to her life. What do you think?
I think that resonates with me a lot. We obviously don't know for sure if there's a romance budding between them in that game, but it's certainly hinted at in other games in the series. And yeah, they're not well matched in the traditional classist sense, right? That she is royalty and he's, interestingly enough, a war refugee in that game, right? That his mother fled to the forest and died and asked the Deku Tree to take care of him. So they come from opposite worlds, and really part of the pain of that parting is that there was never going to be able to be anything between them.
I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the first time we see them being even close to being on the same level is in Skyward Sword when they're both training at that Knight Academy.
Yes. Yeah. I think a lot of people were pretty excited about that being included in Skyward Sword. Of maybe, is it finally possibly going to happen between the two? So.
Yeah. And I think her dad is the headmaster. So she has a little bit of status in a sense, but really and truly, it's not to the extent of, oh, I'm a royal princess and I have these roles to fulfill, versus you're just some little kid from the forest who has left it only once.
Right.
Yeah. Well, what are some of your other favorite articles you've written for Zelda Dungeon?
Well, I have one coming up. It's not out yet, but it'll be out, I believe, September 1st. It's a daily debate article about the inclusion of mythological characters in Legend of Zelda, and this was definitely an article that kind of hit my love of all things English related, but also Legend of Zelda. And the question that I asked was, would you like to see more mythologically inspired enemies in The Legend of Zelda in future games? And thinking obviously about the centaur-inspired Lionels. We have the Hinniks, which of course are inspired by Cyclops. And I just wrote a little bit about, that first time of going to, it's not called Koholint Island in Breath of the Wild. The name is totally slipping my mind here, but it's based
Eventide.
Eventide, thank you.
Eventide. Okay.
Yes. Going to Eventide Island and, all the reference to Koholint and coming over the ridge between the bushes and seeing the Hinniks there laying down, and just immediately my mind was thinking about Odysseus and being on this other strange island and seeing the Cyclops, and just all the little nods to Greek mythology. I love that. So I was pretty passionate about that, and I would love to see that included more in future Zelda games as well.
That's a great analogy. That's a great comparison. That is so cool. Do you have a favorite Greek myth?
Ooh.
I know, that's like...
the idea of stealing fire from the gods and creating equality, or maybe not equality, but raising up humanity is always really interesting to me. Crossing the river Styx and going, into the underworld also, I think, captures my imagination a little bit as well. So stories in which human beings in mythology do things that they're not supposed to do, right? That we somehow find a way to get into good trouble, to do things that no one expected us to be able to do, steal the fleece, right? Those kinds of stories always capture my imagination.
Yeah, they're really cool. And sometimes they can seem a little intimidating, or you don't really... Sometimes people don't get them when they read them when they're younger, but then as you get older, you can see that reflected so much in the real world.
Definitely.
I really liked your article. I have two saved for reference. I liked your daily debate about, is it time to move on from the Master Sword? And you alluded to several Zelda titles where Link does not use the Master Sword, like a Majora's Mask. He does not have a Master Sword.
Yeah, and speaking of articles that got a lot of hate, this one as well. But I think sometimes people feel like if you ask a question for discussion, that you are recommending that we do away with it. Look, for everybody listening, I love the Master Sword. I'm not proposing getting rid of it, but I do think it's interesting that we ask questions sometimes for how can we make our favorite stories bigger and include more. Would it hurt to have one or two more mythical weapons in addition to the Master Sword? So that's kind of what I was thinking with that. And it is true. We sometimes think, it's like peanut butter and jelly, right? They go together, Link and the Master Sword, but he doesn't actually use it in a majority of the games. There are quite a few games where he doesn't. And, the Four Sword is the one that appears in the most games. Then there's a lot of just singular swords that appear in other games outside of the Master Sword. And the Four Sword actually has a little bit of mythology around it, with Vati and releasing him into the world and the turning Link into four heroes. And there's this own little mythology around it that, in my opinion, doesn't take away from the game. It adds to this very rich tapestry that is the Zelda universe. So I would love to see more mythical weapons in the future. Some really great commenters for that article too have brought up things like, why not have like a legendary spear? What if there was a way to take the essence of the Master Sword and put it in other kinds of weapons, like an axe or something like that? So I love those ideas. Anything that, not that I don't appreciate the same story over and over again and revisit things, but man, if we can add to it, why not?
Yeah. And of course, I'm sure that there referencing Arthurian legend with the Master Sword, right?
Right.
The sword in the stone.
Pulling it out of the stone.
And Link's the only one who can wield it, just like Arthur's the only one who can wield it. And that, gosh, you're making, as you're discussing this is making me think, oh, and I'm sure somebody's going to come for me when I ask this. Is the Master Sword truly what slays evil? Because in Breath of the Wild, you have to keep recharging it.
Mm-hmm.
And you can still kill other creatures with other weapons and things like that. So, in fact, I seldom use the Master Sword in Breath of the Wild.
Well, it's interesting that you bring it up. I think one thing that I both love and feel frustrated about with Nintendo sometimes is that Nintendo prioritizes gameplay above all else, above storytelling. And sometimes that's really wonderful because it's rare to play a Nintendo game that's just bad controls wise and gameplay wise. Like you can pretty much count on a minimum standard of quality for Nintendo. The downside is there are times where Nintendo's storytelling really lags behind other systems. And I say that as a Nintendo fan. I love Nintendo, but it's true. And I think with Breath of the Wild, their desire to encourage players to experiment, to try new things, to use weapons other than the Master Sword was really successful. And in order to make that happen, they had to have the weapon breaking mechanic that everybody complains about. They had to have the Master Sword run out of energy. My question is, did the story suffer as a result of that, right? Like, did that lessen the status of the Master Sword? And for me, ultimately, I didn't care because I loved the fact that I got to experiment and it forced me to have to use other weapons or to, be on top of my supply management. I think that added to the complexity of the game. But I do think that perhaps is a small dent in the sort of mythology of the Master Sword, maybe.
Yeah, that's a great point. And is the true power within Link already? With the Triforce of Courage. Don't get me wrong, guys. I love the Master Sword. It's cool. I mean, frankly, you could put any weapon in the hands. I'm more interested in the storyline. The Master Sword is simply a tool to me.
Absolutely.
It's not the end-all, be-all for the series for me to love it or hate it, right?
Right. And it doesn't have to go away forever. We could come back to it. Even when I ask things like getting back to the social class article, when I ask stuff like that, it's never to tear down the series, but how can we make it bigger? And including more mythological weapons or mythic weapons in the game will just offer more to players, not less. And I think sometimes we react out of fear of, this is something I love, don't you dare take it away from it or ruin it, instead of, change is scary.
Yeah, and something about the social class, I'm very interested in exploring the relationship between the Hylians and the different races. Mm-hmm. And they've changed as the series progressed, especially the Gerudo. I'm not going to spoil anything, but that's something I'm working on for another Zelda podcast on the side. So just a little speculative writing going on.
I would love to check that out.
It'll be coming out in September. So it's just, they're a tribe, for example, that I was very excited to see them walking around the world in Breath of the Wild. It was, oh my goodness, that blew my mind. And to see them actively pursuing their boyfriends. They alluded to it in Ocarina of Time if you talk to a Gossip Stone, but there is that little side quest where you can have these two people meet. It's a Gerudo and a Hylian at that little heart-shaped
heart lake.
Yes. And I thought that was so cool. And I especially love in Gerudo Town the classes. Did you walk in on the classes that you can attend?
The dating classes, those were fantastic.
I love the dialogue, and I love how she asked the different students, okay, what do you do in this situation? And two of the ladies have pretty calm, tame answers, and then one of them talks about how she's going to wrestle him or something. The teacher says, well, meet me after class. We're going to have a discussion about this. Gosh, I love that.
And that's a great example too. I know that Breath of the Wild struggles in terms of storytelling when held up to other Zelda games. But one thing that we should acknowledge is how well the game tells a story through dialogue of characters. And if you're willing to spend the time talking to everybody in Gerudo Town, the story is told. It's just not told in a traditional fixed camera narration that we're all so used to. And so I think maybe the storytelling is a little underappreciated in Breath of the Wild because it's done in a different format than what we're used to.
Now this is segueing away from Zelda, but you made me think of it. So I believe, is that called implicit storytelling?
Yes.
A little bit.
Yeah, I would say so. In opposed to the explicit narrator directly spoon feeding you the storyline, which, you know, we're all of us are lazy processors, so we prefer things that are given directly to us just inherently with the way our brains work. But if we're willing to be out of our comfort zone and put in the hard work, that implicit storytelling can be really beautiful.
Yes, and it helps you feel like you're the explorer discovering things.
Yes.
In that way. And what brought to mind this type of storytelling is the remake of Resident Evil 2. I don't know if you're a fan of the Resident Evil series at all.
I've played a little bit. I think it's been since the GameCube game since I played.
Oh, there's nothing wrong with that. It was so the older ones probably have this, but with the remake of 2 that came out in early 2019, I'm someone who is not so much interested in the carnage, but the stories. Like, I want that game, that series is a great example of read the diaries, read the memos, explore your surroundings, look around. And someone wrote a great article about the implicit storytelling in Resident Evil 2. For example, when you're at the police station, if you enter from one of the sides, you see some body bags and you see some graves that looked like they had been dug up, and they're getting rid of the deceased and they're running out of room. So no one in the game, no characters say anything about that, but you look at it and that tells you just how serious things were getting in Raccoon City. So guys, you got to explore video games. Oh my gosh. I'm someone who I will talk to every NPC multiple times.
Same.
Yes. Especially they put in all that work for the dialogue, right?
That's right. I'm always worried that I need to click it one more time just in case there's an additional message. I guess Zelda games have trained me that way.
Yes, and then you don't want to accidentally hit if it's like a did you get all that, and you accidentally hit no. Oh, it's so like that's one time I regret pressing B too fast. You also had another great article. It was another daily debate about why does Lanayru warn that Link can be ruled by the Fused Shadow in Twilight Princess. You want to talk about that one?
Yeah, thank you. I come around more often and give me all these compliments. Yeah, you know, I think there was an article I wrote in July asking if people would play a game where Link could choose to be evil. And my inspiration for that article was going back to a game I played in college, Knights of the Old Republic. I don't know if you ever played any of the Star Wars games on Xbox, but you have the option of choosing the light side or the dark side. And many games have done that since, but that one's always stuck out with me. And so in asking this about, you know, whether people would play a game that Link could be evil, like overwhelming response of like, how could you ask this? Link is always good. Link is a white hat. You know, this is unquestioning. Have you even ever played a Zelda game? And, you know, so when I was playing Twilight Princess again with my daughter and I came across that part, I was just kind of surprised because it really did seem like the game itself was suggesting that Link is corruptible and that, like all people, he had the potential for evil. If you haven't played Twilight Princess, one of the light spirits, which are sort of these guardians to keep Hyrule safe, warns Link of getting too close to this evil weapon, the Fused Shadow that he's trying to get so they can find the antagonist. And the light spirit warns Link that if he touches it, that the power could be corrupting and could turn him evil like it has other characters in the game. And it made me want to stop and have that conversation with folks of, you know, even somebody who is iconic as Link, does he have the possibility for evil? And ultimately, you know, that should make us reflect on ourselves and what possibilities do we all have to succumb to sort of our darker desires. So
Yeah, and I did read through the comments, and they weren't as heated as the other articles
Yeah, no,
comments,
it was good.
thankfully. But there were some people, I did notice one comment did say, I like the idea of Link being corruptible. He's human. I would like to see that change up, that dynamic. I mean, we fight Dark Link in Ocarina of Time, and if you want to delve really deep, maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe it was just a cool feature. A lot of people look at that as the symbolism of Link battling his inner feelings, and we take for granted that, oh, this is a game. But if you think about it, he's still a kid. He's only 17, and he hasn't gone through 7 years of growing up to reach 17. It's a sudden transformation. So is he still operating with the mind of a 10-year-old in some ways? I don't know, maybe.
The black and white thinking. I mean, that is the brain development that we all go through. We go through that black and white thinking. I think also, and granted, these games were made before this moment with us now, but hopefully that idea is explored, as that commenter said, in future Zelda games. I think we live in a time where our faith in institutions has been shaken, as a country. I mean, large institutions, not promoting anyone, but for example, the Catholic Church had all of its scandals, and a lot of people left the Catholic Church. We had the financial crisis in 2008, where a lot of people were forced out of their homes, and the people that were engaging in predatory lending practices, nobody went to jail, right? We have had both parties have had a turn in the Oval Office, and yet things haven't really gotten a whole lot better for the average person in this country. And so we do have this time where our faith that there are truly good people or just truly bad people is sort of this simple way of looking in the world. It's not that way anymore, that there are no more heroes in some ways. And maybe it's time our video games reflect that as well.
That's a great point. And this is going to be a personal note. It was funny that you brought up the Catholic Church. I live in a predominantly Catholic area.
Right.
And I even went to Catholic school. But I mean, I think I'm fortunate the time period I grew up in more so than what my grandma grew up in. She's an example. She told me that for whatever reason, she decided to ask their priest if she could attend the wedding of her best friend because her best friend was Baptist.
Mm.
I cannot even fathom. First of all, I wouldn't even think to tell the priest my business.
Right.
But he told her that she could not even attend the wedding because she's Catholic. Wow. And she's 80. My grandma's 80 now. And whenever she tells that story, she always says, I deeply regret not going to my best friend's wedding and serving in her wedding. So I hate that she went through that, but I am happy to hear her show her regret. And as things have evolved, there are people in my family who, through just the wheels of tradition, oh, you have to get baptized, you have to get confirmed, you have to get married in the Catholic Church. My grandma's 80 and says that she thinks it's really important for people to live together before they get married so they can get to know get to know each other. So it's I think the only way is up, and there will always be evil in the world, but there will always be people who want to fight that evil.
Right.
And we have to find the courage, just like Link.
And if I could just add to that, I think one advantage of not thinking in such black and white terms, that people are either all good or all evil, is that if and when we mess up, that doesn't mean that we're suddenly in the evil category, that we can allow space for people to be imperfect and hopefully to have a path back towards redemption. That's one thing I think in our culture, and I understand the desire for things like cancel culture, because a lot of the times it's folks who have been disempowered for so long wanting to finally have the power and to say, no, you do this to me again, you're canceled. And then there's the other half of the sort of coin too, where how do we as a society allow a path for redemption and to bring people back into the fold at some point and to move beyond things that they've done that are wrong or missing the mark. And I don't have a good answer for that, but I just think that's one product of getting out of black and white thinking, is hopefully we realize if we can all mess up, then we all need a place to be brought back in.
Yeah, it's really So I'm a big fan of makeup and cosmetics, and I don't know how much you know about that realm.
That is not a strong suit for me.
But there's a lot of cancel culture in there because there are some YouTubers like beauty gurus or different companies, and people dig through their tweets, they deal through their practices. They don't allow them a chance to redeem themselves. Or if you're using a certain product, people automatically might assume, oh, you support so and so, so you're an evil person. And I just don't think that's fair. Maybe there is a more sinister thing behind the choice, the decision, but around where I live, Walmart is one of the biggest retailers. There are upper class people, but it's a lot of middle class and lower income families. And I don't think they would survive if they couldn't afford the cheaper items. And that's not to say that there aren't evil things happening at the corporate level, but I can't go look at someone who's supporting this large family on less than $20,000 a year and say, oh, you can't shop there. How dare you? You have to go to the fancy store.
Right. For people who are already very put upon by society to have this added burden of, oh, and you're also the one that needs to bear the moral responsibility while trying to feed your family.
Yeah, they're just trying to eat. I think most people
Right.
are just trying to get through the day, right? Like most people just want to pay their bills and have a freedom from fear.
Right.
That's what they want. Gosh, this is getting so deep. Oh, I'm going to cry. I hate judgment, and we're all guilty of it, right? We're all guilty of judging somebody. We're all human. We all have our preconceptions and biases, but it's how you choose to allow that to dominate you.
Yeah.
Right? And so is there anything else you would like to say about Zelda or Zelda Dungeon or anything?
I mean, I think you got to a lot of it. I'm just very grateful to have a chance to write and to talk with people who are really passionate about video games too. I think I've gathered enough courage. I'm going to try write an article about gender roles in Gerudo Town. I think there's a lot that the Gerudo in Breath of the Wild do in a very subtly way to explore gender in our society, and I'm sure that will, if social class ruffled some feathers, I'm sure we getting to non-binary characters and gender in Breath of the Wild, that will ruffle a few feathers. But I think that's where I would like to go next. So I'm still working on learning courage as a writer and just putting that out there. But yeah.
My gosh, why don't we show them some books that have been banned throughout time, and
right.
let them comment on those. Oh, I'm all for freedom of thought and expression.
Sure.
People can read something without feeling like, I don't understand why they feel like it's a personal attack.
Yes, I definitely had my worth as a human being evaluated very thoroughly after the last article, but I'm also learning to have thick skin, so it's good.
Oh, yeah. And you're also an aspiring writer, so your thick skin's going to have to come in handy big time with that.
Yes.
Do you have any current projects regarding writing?
I do. So I've been working on my novel for about a decade. I actually pitched it at the Northwest Writers Association Writers Conference this past fall, and I did have a pretty successful pitch session. I had 5 agents and an editor want a copy of my manuscript. The editor, I still need to finish my changes before I send it to her. But unfortunately, as often happens in the writing process, I just wasn't a good match with the agent, either for the genre of writing I was doing, or because, my writing's just not there yet. There's always room for growth in writing, but we get very comfortable with rejection. But so I have finished my manuscript, and I'm about my 3rd rewrite through on it, and hoping to I was supposed to attend the writers conference again this fall and repitch it, but with COVID I'm gonna have to take that off. So
would you like to talk about the genre or the topic of
yeah
writing?
Is that okay? I didn't
Yes. Oh gosh, it's all about you, David.
Okay. Something about me is I'm a pretty strong introvert, so I'm grateful for the chance to be on here and stretch myself a little bit. The words "it's all about you" are very terrifying. So,
Oh, I understand.
um, yeah, so it's in the fantasy genre, but it's not classical sort of high fantasy. It's I think the category. It took me some research to figure out what category my novel's in, but I think you would call it like urban fantasy or contemporary fantasy. And the inspiration for my novel was actually a couple of things. So, a brief story, if that's okay. One of my lifelong childhood friends, this was a number of years ago now, he got cancer when he was really young. He was in his mid 20s from a medication he was taking for another health condition. It was really sad. He found out 2 months before he died that he had really bad stage 4 cancer.
I'm so sorry.
That was it. And it was, that was a really profound sort of moment for me. It was my, everybody probably remembers the first person you lost that was really close to you like that. And he sticks out to me. But he was in the hospital towards the end, and I was going to go visit him and, say our goodbyes and whatnot. And he had slipped into a coma the day before I was able to come visit him, and had been in a coma for a while. And so I thought, okay, well, prepared myself emotionally. I was like, I'm going to go visit him. And I did. And I came at a time where nobody was there. So I just sat in his hospital room there, and he happened to wake up. He happened to wake from his coma, and it was the only time he woke from his coma, pretty much until he died. And I, to this day, feel a little guilty that his family wasn't there and all these other people, but there was nobody. I mean, it was just me there. So I asked him. I said, "Hey, how you doing? I'm so glad that you woke up." And we talked for a bit, and I asked him, I said, "Hey, do you remember what it was like when you're in your coma? Like, I've always wondered that. You tell me about that." And he had been on a respirator, and so he had a hard time talking. So I had to really lean in to hear him. And he was whispering. He said, David, he started crying. He said it was more real in my coma than anything I'd ever experienced in my life. And he just started sobbing about what he had experienced while he was in this coma. And I was like, okay, well, do you want me to write this down for you? Is there something I can do to help you remember it? And he just looked at me. He's like, it's too important. I got to write it myself. And then he died shortly thereafter. And I never talked to him about it again. But I'll never forget that experience. And, both as a person just trying to process my grief of losing my friend, and also as someone who's curious and a writer, this just stuck with me. And after a lot of time of grieving, I thought, okay, I need to write about this, both just for my own healing. And it's just this idea that I can't get out of my head of what is that like? And so I wrote a novel about a man who's on his deathbed, and he wakes up inside his own soul, what I imagine to be my friend's experience in his coma. And he journeys through this very physical place, like, a modern, landscape, seeing these very ugly and broken places in his soul, and also these very beautiful places, these gorgeous landscapes that he falls in love with. And over the course of the story, he understands that the place he's traveling through is actually his soul, and that he, in order to find his way out, he's going to have to learn to love the parts of himself that he doesn't love, the parts that are left over from trauma and the dark parts of his life, if he's going to save this place. And so the story unfolds that way. And, of course, in addition to processing my friend's death, it helped me process a lot of my own grief. I mean, it's certainly, every writer, I suppose, writes themselves in their first story, and realizing, okay, I have these sort of ugly parts of myself that are leftovers from trauma, and how do I learn to love those and see those as beautiful too? So,
please do share your work when it's ready, because we would love to interview you again and talk about it more in depth and everything. And I'm really sorry for your loss. That's hard.
That.
Have you dabbled in any other types of writing, like poetry or anything else?
Not that I like to admit. I do have a collection of poems that I wrote in college, and but I definitely think that that's not the genre that I'm gifted in. So that collection of poems will, maybe somebody will find it when I'm dead. But
oh gosh, were you a big writer when you were younger?
I was always really interested in writing. When I was real young, first grade, and they ask you what you want to do when you grow up. I knew I wanted to be a forest ranger and a writer. And at various points in my life, I forgot about both those things and have sort of wandered back to them with, studying forestry in college and now finding myself being a writer, which I still don't know how I got here. So
I don't think anyone really does. It's just it kind of happens. It doesn't really work out maybe how you're thinking it will.
Mm-hmm.
Who really knows at 12, 13 what you're going to be doing when you're in your 20s, your 30s and beyond. And people change careers all the time. And something that really inspires me is hearing about people who are much older having their magnum opus come out, or
Yes.
delving into something that makes their heart sing, like when they're in their 60s, 70s, 80s.
That's not too late.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's no timeline for life. It's really hard to get caught up in that and to compare yourself to your peers, especially with social media now. People are only going to share the highlights, right?
Absolutely. There's plenty of 20-somethings out there who have already published 4 books, and it's just like, oh, get out of my newsfeed. I can't.
No. Yes, but
hey,
you're not. But you still have a story to tell. The age doesn't matter. In fact, your story might be richer now because you've had so many more life experiences to develop it. This applies to relationships, but I think it can apply to your art as well. It's something like if you ask someone, where have you been my whole life? If you meet somebody that you really click with and the response was becoming the person you needed me to be.
Wow.
I know.
Yeah, that's it, isn't it?
I know. So just some people don't meet their partner till much later, or they maybe never meet somebody, but they have so many friendships and other great relationships. I think that's the same with your art, right? It's never too late. Don't compare yourself with the 20-something.
Right. And certainly the self-criticism comes easy, I think, when you create any kind of content, and writing is a particularly exposing art form. So the community is so needed to have that encouragement and reminder that we're all on our own journey, because you just won't get there. I am actually in a writers group with my colleagues, and we meet periodically and share our writing and get feedback. And that's been a great venue for me to overcome my anxiety and self-doubt. And honestly, it's something that I ask my students to do. I make them go in writing groups when they have their essays and share their essays. So it's been good for me to, have to do the same medicine that I give them, so to speak.
So. You can understand their fears.
Yes, absolutely.
What you're doing for your friend who passed away, the inspiration, in a way, you're kind of acting like Shakespeare, where he talks about how he can immortalize people in his writing, right? A lot of his sonnets deal with that, with I've immortalized you in this poem. I've immortalized you in my writing. So he's going to live on.
That's right. That's the hope.
Oh, yes, he will. And his life is richer for having you in it, I think. So you also are very interested in activism. Is that something you're comfortable talking about?
It is. It absolutely is. I have another Twitter account that I keep separate, that I engage in my activism life, and then I try to have my Twitter account that I do for my writing. And while I feel a little guilty about that on some level, I also, every other part of my life, my activism is integrated in, and so my writing is my kind of escape place. But at any rate, I do feel really passionate, probably because of my own history of overcoming difficulty with trauma, and the fact that I'm in education and I see inequities on a pretty regular basis, and I want to see the world get better. So my areas of passion, is it okay if I talk about issues that are important to me? The two big ones for me are healthcare and the environment. Those are things that I feel very, very passionate about, with being an environmental science major in college and studying forestry, and just seeing how much damage we're doing to our planet, and having 2 children of my own, and wanting to pass on the world to them, and even just nature in general. I love camping and fishing and kayaking. I love being out in it. It just makes me so sad to see what we're doing to our planet. So I'm pretty active with that and pretty passionate about things like the Green New Deal. And similarly with healthcare, there was a pretty large period of my life when I graduated and was just working my way through retail jobs that I didn't have health insurance. I mean, I remember a very distinct period of time, like 3 years, 4 years, where I didn't go to a doctor, didn't go to the dentist because I just didn't have insurance. And that certainly created a lot of empathy for me that, I feel like, man, we're the richest country in the history of this planet. Like we can probably provide healthcare for people, like, not to take away from all the other things that people love to, spend money on or think it's important. I don't want to argue with people who feel like we need a strong military. Like that's their business. That's great. We want to make room in the budget for that. That's fine. But man, let's make sure no one dies from something we can cure if they just had the money.
Yeah, that's a lot of guilt on our conscience.
Right.
So that's a heavy, knowing especially preventable things as well.
So I do quite a bit of political writing, both in my job as an educator, trying to leverage school districts into being more inclusive, or, kind of recording my own thoughts on what changes need to happen in society. And then also, which is harder now that I'm a parent, but, attending marches and things like that when I'm able to, that's something that I try to do. It's definitely different being a parent now and trying to balance, modeling these sort of values for my kids and also keeping them safe and recognizing we're in, things like a pandemic and like, how do I find that line between modeling the kind of person I want my kids to be and making sure that they're not exposed to too much. So that's hard.
Yeah. Are your children very young?
So my daughter is 8, and my son is adopted. We adopted him a few years ago. He is 14, just turned 14 now. So they're a little spread out. I feel too young to have a 14-year-old, but it's that's been good, and they both keep me on my toes a lot. So they're high energy.
And they're at those very impressionable ages. So I think it is important to help instill your values and have them question things,
Sure.
A lot of parents say, well, I'm the boss, that's why, or I said that, that's why.
That's right.
And are there any other, sorry, go ahead. Oh, no, you're good.
Just, I think they're very curious. Like you said, they're very impressionable right now, and they have questions about what's happening in the world, and finding that balance between explaining these are the things that are happening in society. We are treating people fill in the blank way, but also recognizing that I don't want their childhood to be full of fear, and how do I find that balance of balancing that privilege that they have as, 2 white kids in a relatively safe neighborhood now, with also they need to be aware of the world and they have the power to do something about it. And there's, for as much as I second guess myself with writing, it's like that exponentially with parenting. Lots of nights of waking up thinking, oh, I should have done that differently. But
I think that's a sign of a good parent. You care.
Thank you. I hope so. That's true.
Are there any other type of activist topics you'd like to discuss, or are those the ones you're mainly focused on?
Well, yes. So, I feel very strongly about Green New Deal and Medicare for All. Those are my, if I could pick 2 issues for sure, but also homelessness is something I'm really passionate about. My wife and I used to do quite a bit of working with the street community. It's really hard because we drive, all of us, you, me, everyone, drive by, that person on the freeway holding the sign, or, through parts of town, and we don't want to stop or talk to them. Or, I think now when I have my kids, it's like, well, my kid's safe if I go get out and talk to them. But then the other reality is, how do we have a society that's compassionate and empathetic and takes the time to meet people and understand their story? And over the years, my wife and I have tried to make a point of, walking up introducing ourselves, shaking hand, and just listening. Hey, how'd you get here? Tell me about your experience. And the stories that I've heard over the years are just so heartbreaking. So, it's easy for folks to yell things like get a job out the window, or, to be resentful. I'm struggling, so why should you get help? But the reality is that so many folks on the street, I don't want to pull a number out of my head, but it's a high percentage number have experienced abuse at home, and are dealing with the mental health challenges that come from that. And certainly, beyond just the personal mental health reasons that people end up homeless, we're at a time where, we have 40 million Americans that are about to be evicted. We have people that have lost homes in the recession, and so there's so many reasons people end up on the street. And it's often not just, well, they're lazy or they don't want to just take any job that's out there. And so raising awareness for that, encouraging people to see the humanity in others is something I'm really passionate about. I will say that during the pandemic, that's gotten exponentially harder, right? We have this fear of coming in contact with anyone, let alone somebody that we don't even know. I was at the grocery store the other day, and there was a woman with a small baby out there. And I haven't really stopped and talked to a homeless person as much as I used to because of the pandemic, but she was just sobbing with her baby there. And I just was like, okay, I got to go talk to her. So I had my mask on and I did my 6 feet thing, and I just listened to her, and she was just crying because her son had asthma and he couldn't afford his inhaler. And with COVID going on, she was constantly afraid that he was going to get this lung disease, and she just needed the money for her medication. And so we were able to go get the medicine she needed in the pharmacy. She was only a few dollars short, but she said afterwards that I was literally the first person that stopped and talked to her all day. And that's not a story about, me at all. It's just that the thing that sticks out to me is how sad it is that here's this woman who's in need and we all let her down. Like, nobody has stopped and talked to her. And to be honest, 9 times out of 10, I probably wouldn't have stopped and talked to her either. So, I don't know what we do about that. I know homelessness is a complicated issue, but I think step one is learning to see humanity in each other and have compassion.
It can happen to anybody.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
you bring up a good point about the job situation, because it's so much more than, let me go walk to this place and say I need to work. I mean, you likely have to have good hygiene. You have to have access to transportation. You have to have a way to take care of yourself and make yourself presentable for someone to want to hire you, right? You have to have an address usually.
Right.
And there's just so many factors that we take for granted. And even buying a home is so complicated that it's expensive too. Mm-hmm. And rent is expensive. And if you're at the mercy of someone else,
right,
that's really heartbreaking. And a lot, I've heard this argument before. Well, they're just going to take my $5 and go buy drugs.
Right.
I'm like, you know what? I can't control what someone's going to do with this money I give them. But that's not my responsibility, right? Like, that's, if they want to do that, I can't control that. I'm not going to go follow them around. And I hate that argument, because I think, I'm sure my money down the line has been used for much worse without my realizing.
Absolutely. My wife, she's got her doctorate. She inspires me every day. She's a trauma psychologist, and she works with some of the most broken people in society. And we've actually discussed that exact reaction that you brought up. And she's told me many times, and it's always stuck with me. She's like, what if they do buy drugs? So what? Oftentimes the people who are on the street, as we mentioned, come from severe physical and sexual abuse backgrounds. Maybe getting high, while not the right medicine for them, is the only thing that gets them through the day. We need to approach with compassion and understanding first. Obviously, that's not the solution we want anybody to have. But when people are so broken and so hurting, like, who am I to say you don't have a right to get through that day? Like, so as you said, like, here's your $5, whatever you're going to do with it, you're going to do with it. And to be honest, most people aren't using it for drugs. That's just a convenient excuse we tell ourselves. Most people are just trying to get their motel room for the night or food to feed their family. But even if someone does, man, having been through trauma myself, I definitely don't have a right to judge how somebody survives their trauma. So
Yeah. And how many people who are not homeless use it to buy certain substances that are not the
Right.
best for them?
Right.
So who are you to point a finger
Right.
and try to make this person look worse? And like you said, there are safety issues. You do have to exercise good judgment, and if you're with your children or if you're in an area where you do feel uncomfortable, absolutely
Right.
be cognizant and make your best call for you always. But at the same time, they're people. They're people. Just like you and me, and it is a complicated issue. And uh, there are so many people who, oh gosh, I'm getting on my soapbox. There are so many people who are very good at talking the talk, but not good at walking the walk.
Yeah.
There's a lot of hypocrisy. There are a lot of people who believe in the prosperity gospel, and
Sure.
that doesn't sit well with me.
If you're poor, you must have done something wrong, because if you were living right, you'll have what you need. And man, I wish life was that simple.
You're not kidding. And bad things happen to people who seem to be doing everything right as well. And I don't have an answer for that. No one does. Why
Right.
do bad things happen to good people? In fact, knowing that bad things happen to good and quote unquote bad people, that should make us more compassionate.
Absolutely.
I think.
I'm on the same page with you there.
Oh man, I'm gonna cry after this episode. I'm very sensitive to those things, and I don't have the solution. And I try to think. I don't really practice anymore with religion, but there was a saint called Saint Teresa of Lisieux who was called the Little Flower of Jesus. She died when she was 24, and she was very ill her whole life, and she felt intimidated, kind of like you, where you compare yourself to other people and the great things they've accomplished. She's like, I can't do these great things. I can't go travel the world. I'm poor. But something that stuck with me, and I think can resonate with religious, non-religious, anybody, secular, she said, I'm going to define my life by the little things I can do every day. Little kind deeds, whether that's opening the door for someone, or like you, David, giving someone the attention to feel like a human in front of that store. Even if you're not out there erecting churches or
Sure.
schools in Africa or other countries that are popular for mission trips, it's no good deed is undone. I think about times if a stranger even buys me a coffee or something.
Right.
So yeah,
That's all we have. That's all we can do and control is what we do in the moment.
exactly. And I think what you're doing is important, and it'll have a ripple effect.
Sure.
So you might not see the big results right away. You might not see them in your lifetime, but you'll see them in those moments. And your students and the people you touch, they might not verbalize to you, but you could live within their mind.
That's a thought.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Especially you're bringing up your teachers. You think about them and they've influenced you so much, and you may not necessarily talk to them every day, every year, but they're living on. Their legacy lives on. Well, is there anything else you'd like to talk about before I ask you the most important part of this interview?
Oh my goodness. I think we've covered it all, but I'm curious what the most important part is.
We like to talk about food.
Okay.
It's just I joined Boss Rush podcast in June, and I just started asking them, what are you guys eating lately? What are some of your favorite snacks? So I like to get to know people that way too, and ask them, what are some of your favorite snacks or your favorite meals? So would you like to share any of those?
I would. I hesitate because I like to keep this secret because I feel like people are going to assume I'm judging them all the time. But I'm actually vegan. I've been vegan for 7 years. I am totally okay with people that aren't vegan, so I should just put that out there. I'm not vegan.
You're not going to find them.
Yeah. There are some of those missionary vegan out there that are a little hard to be around, but I'm not one of those. But yeah, so my wife is she's so amazing. I appreciate her so much. She makes like gourmet vegan meals all the time and always is willing to try like new recipes. And when I'm able, I like to help with that cooking as well and learn about it a little bit. We kind of trade off responsibilities, so I'm not always able to do that. But this week we made tandoori. She made tandoori cauliflower on top of rice and salad, and it was just fantastic. And there's a food blog we really like. It's got kind of a funny name, but it's called Clean Food Dirty Girl. And the reason they call it that is because she kind of has a potty mouth that the blogger does, but she makes all this clean food. She used to be a professional chef. Her name is Molly. I don't remember her last name, and she makes some of the best food I've tasted in my life. So that's something that we kind of do regularly. Like weekly, we try to make these week-long meal plans from Clean Food Dirty Girl, and it's all vegan food, and it's great. So my son is not vegan; he is a meat eater. My daughter is vegan. So every night at dinner we end up making like 4 different meals to make sure everybody can come to the table. So there's always lots of dirty dishes in my house, but we try to keep our teenage son and very picky 8-year-old daughter happy at the table. So
that sounds delicious. I'm not vegan, but I like vegan dishes. I'm not opposed to trying alternate recipes. I like dabbling in that. So thank you for sharing that blog and those ideas.
When we visited New Orleans for our anniversary last year, there's a couple vegan restaurants that you all have down there that are just unbelievable. So we went to, I think it's called Bread on Oaks. It's a bakery in New Orleans. It's just got incredible food. And there's another restaurant called, I think it's called Soul Food. Anyway, it's just got amazing like Southern vegan food. And that was great. So...
I am willing to try that. I am willing to. I cannot wait till things are back to normal and I can feel comfortable going there in a big city. Thank you for that, Dave.
Oh, yeah.
Well, is there anything else you'd like to share with the listeners?
No, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. This was a great experience, and you really made me feel comfortable as a person who struggles with anxiety and is very introverted often. I really appreciated being here.
Oh, no, the pleasure's all mine. Thank you for taking time out of your Saturday to do this. I really appreciate it. I love these 1v1s because I get to meet people. And I think I'm someone who thinks everybody has a story, even at the store. I'm like, I wonder what's going on in their lives. What are they passionate about? So I really appreciate your taking the time to tell us about your projects, about Zelda, about your activism, your teaching. And I'm really eager to hear what listeners have to say, if anything resonates with them in particular. But David, where can people find you if they want to follow you on Twitter?
Yes, that would be fantastic. I am at David Lasby on Twitter. So LAS as in Sam, B as in Bravo, Y, Lasby. And I like to talk about all things writing and video games there. And yeah, I usually don't get into politics too much on there, but I love interacting with people. And you can also find me on Zelda Dungeon as well.
Yes, you guys have to go read his articles. He is really good and he brings up some really great points, especially if you like the more academic style of writing, which I personally do. But guys, you can find Boss Rush Games on Twitter. Boss Rush, I think it's just at Boss Rush Games. Forgive me, Corey. He'll have it in the show notes. He'll have all the links to this. And I'm also with Another Zelda podcast. You can find that on Twitter. You can find our website, Instagram. But until next time, thank you so much, David, and we'll talk to you later.
Thank you.
All right, bye, guys.